Banned Pokemon, you know them, you love them. Welcome to another GTS compilation, and today we're talking about the Pokemon that were blocked from things like the GTS and Pokemon Home. Make sure you have your season pass because here we go. It's always so interesting to see why various Pokemon are banned from competitive play. There's usually a decent enough reason, and while there are a handful of Pokemon that are totally allowed in competitive play, they're not allowed on the GTS. While the Global Trading Station, or GTS for short, seems like a revolutionary idea for Pokemon, allowing you to list Pokemon for trade anywhere in the world, it's notorious for being, well, literal garbage. One thing it did right was place restrictions on certain words for Pokemon nicknames to make sure nothing vulgar was put onto the GTS. This filter system would work a lot better for text instead of audio recordings like with Chatot. But the unintended consequence is that Pokemon like Nosepass, Skuntank, and Cofagrigus were not allowed to be put on the GTS without a nickname. Yes, while Pokemon names tend to be a mixture of two or more words, Cofagrigus accidentally has a homophobic slur right in the middle, Skuntank accidentally has an angry Australian's favorite word, hey, stop! And Nosepass is... But these Pokemon can still be traded as long as they have a nickname, and of course when it comes to competitive events they're totally fine, but it is still kind of funny an oversight like this happened. While I already talked about Cofagrigus, Skuntank is a pretty cool Pokemon as well. It has one of the best typings in the game, even though it was pretty much always outclassed by Drapion, which has better defenses, but it at least is the signature Pokemon of Jupiter from Team Galactic, which is also cool, even though I'm more of a Mars fan myself. I know there's a long list of other animals that Pokemon have yet to be based off of, but I just think it's pretty neat we got a skunk Pokemon when we did. And Skuntank ended up being pretty cool, getting the ability Stench, which is kind of funny. Nosepass has always been a funny looking Pokemon. Its first sprite made it look so weird, but when it later got harder edges, it looked a lot better. Its evolution Probopass, though, is one that only a mother can love, or maybe even Roxanne. But Nosepass itself has such a fun strategy, which lets a level 1 Nosepass do some funny shenanigans. Nowadays, things have been fixed, and Nosepass, Skuntank, and Cofagrigus have been released from their prison. Before, the filter was in the GTS, while now it's on the Nintendo consoles themselves, which prevents vulgar nicknames from being given to Pokemon. But aside from just vulgarities, technically any Pokemon can be banned from competitive play if it's given a nickname that's a name of another Pokemon. For example, if you've seen any of my live streams, my famous Litten that is nicknamed Rowlet isn't allowed as it is. That is one interesting tidbit, so I figured I'd mention it here, because it goes along with the whole names being banned in Pokemon. This one definitely makes sense just to avoid confusion, especially when you got Pokemon like Ditto and Zoroark running around. It's so weird to think of these Pokemon as being banned when they did nothing wrong. When it came to Chatot, it was because its signature gimmick of chatter inherently had the potential to be exploited, while Cofagrigus, Skuntank, and Nosepass didn't even have to be changed from any input by the player. Again, it was a pretty insignificant restriction, literally just an oversight of a filter set in place. These Pokemon weren't difficult to get, so if anybody wanted to obtain them and use them in battles, they were totally free to do so. I mean, Skuntank was a version exclusive, so if you needed one, the GTS was out of the question. But this filter was apparently only in place during Generation 5, so when Skuntank debuted in Generation 4, everything was fine. The problem was never the Pokemon, it was always the GTS. I do understand why this filter was put into place, but this, along with the ability to request ludicrous trades, I just never liked the GTS and never really used it. Now that the Pokemon community has grown and better connected through the internet, it's much easier to set up trades without it. These three Pokemon being excluded from a small portion of the game is overall pretty forgettable, especially as the problem was later addressed and fixed. It's nowhere near the level of other Pokemon being restricted from competitive online play ever since they were released, or Pokemon that had to have their entire gimmick changed in order to fit in. Nothing about these Pokemon had to be changed and was inherently wrong, so within the course of a generation things were fixed and everyone was able to move on. It's just neat to see that they were part of Pokemon history. And so that's the story of the other banned Pokemon. So quick addition to that video, I know I highlighted Nosepass, Cofagrigus, and Skuntank because they were the funniest in the group, but they weren't the only Pokemon that fell under this unfortunate categorization. Froslass commits the same offense as Nosepass, and Sharpedo... yeah. But the interesting thing about this situation is that it really extends to an even longer list of Pokemon, like ones that have perfectly normal English names, but have a few letters that line up with bad words in other languages, like the Bulbasaur line and Marshtomp. Meanwhile, some of these Pokemon have normal names in other languages, languages, but contain some offensive words in other languages like English or whatever else there might be. Again, none of this was the fault of the Pokemon themselves or even Game Freak or any of the localizers. It was an unintended result of a filter put in place that was very much necessary. I'm not too sure the behind the scenes details, but I feel like it would be possible to at least put a check for a nickname on a Pokemon, so that if it does trigger this flag, it would also check to see if this is due to the result of a nickname or the Pokemon has its original name. But what do I know? On to our next weird little ban.
That's right, everybody, we've got a new banned Pokemon. This time it isn't competitive tournaments or the global trading station, but instead the new source of headaches, Pokemon Home. Yes, that's right, Spinda is not allowed in Pokemon Home, at least if it was caught in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. With the recent addition of Pokemon Home compatibility to Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, some of the messes in the game's code are being brought to light. Back in January of this year, Twitter user @Atreus97 uncovered that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl seem to mess up how Spinda appears in-game. I'll have the thread linked in the description. You can find Spinda in BDSP, but the issue would hypothetically occur when you transfer in a Spinda from a previous generation, causing the spot pattern to be inverted. I don't mean to continue dogging on these games, but how do you mess up a Pokemon that's been around for 20 years? Taking a look back at Spinda, it's a pretty neat little Pokemon with an extremely unique gimmick. Just about every Spinda will have a unique spot pattern. This pattern is based on Spinda's personality value, which is a number generated when a Pokemon is encountered, because this is an RPG with random encounters. This determines various attributes about the Pokemon, but in Spinda's case, it will move around a few dots across its face and print that on the final Pokemon. Because of this, there are over 4,294,967,296 different possible combinations. That's a lot of Spinda. This sounds complicated, but really because it's a small visual difference determined by a number given to every Pokemon, it's been able to stick around for as long as it has, even being developed on the Game Boy Advance. Until Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl got it wrong, having a bug that causes old Spinda to have their spots inverted, which is a pretty big deal. Because every Spinda is roughly 1 in 4 billion, they're very unique. Imagine if you had a Spinda you caught in the original Ruby and Sapphire. Maybe you were even lucky and caught a shiny. You've known this Spinda for years and recognize its unique pattern, and then you transfer it into the Sinnoh remakes only for it to be bald. And so, rather than attempting to fix this bug before Pokemon Home connectivity was added, Spinda is now simply blocked when it comes to transferring between Pokemon Home and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. This just means that you can't move a Spinda from Home into Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl and vice versa. You can still transfer old Spindas into Pokemon Home, and any Spinda you catch in Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl is going to be stuck there. But this creates an interesting dilemma. Do you permanently restrict any Spinda from leaving Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl? And even the idea of attempting to reverse this change would reset the patterns of these Spinda caught in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. Or moving forward, do you differentiate Game Freak Spinda from Ilka Spinda in order for both of them to coexist in Generation 9, 10, and the future? Although that would just create extra work in the future, and would just require Generation 8 Spinda to always be accounted for in future games. So aside from that option, the only other option would be to restrict Spinda from ever leaving Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, or to have their spots reversed when they leave Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl to be the way that they're supposed to be. And that would result in all of these Spindas having their spot pattern changed. So things aren't really the worst, it's just that these specific Spinda are going to be locked in this game. And things should be all good as long as the Spinda you care about was caught in a Game Freak developed game. Nincada is also one of the Pokemon that has a restriction placed on it. Nincada cannot be transferred between Home and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. The reason for this is actually pretty funny, because during the first version of these games there was a glitch that allowed you to clone Pokemon with the use of the daycare. Don't ask me how I know this, and don't ask me why I have so many Master Balls. Because of this, newer updates have added an algorithm to crack down on cloned Pokemon, especially when they're being brought into Pokemon Home. But if you remember that video I made about Shedinja, Nincada's evolution, it is technically a clone. When you evolve Nincada into Ninjask, it sheds its old shell, which then gets possessed and becomes its own Pokemon, Shedinja. It's a cool evolution method with a neat story reason behind it. But Shedinja doesn't technically evolve from Nincada. It just appears and has the exact same information as the Ninjask aside from typing and abilities. So it is, for all intents and purposes, a clone. You're still able to obtain Nincada and its evolutions inside the Sinnoh remakes. They just can't be placed into Pokemon Home because it's easier than having it potentially flagged as an illegitimate clone, when it is in fact legitimate. So realistically, this isn't so much of a case of Pokemon being banned from Pokemon Home, this is more so a quarantine of Pokemon that interact with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl in weird ways. It's not as bad as it could have been, but it's still an unfortunate outcome, but very interesting to watch as it all unfolds. Nincada is at least in Sword and Shield, which was developed by Game Freak, but Generation 8 Spinda, which were developed by Ilka, will seemingly only ever exist in BDSP. So I guess the lesson at the end of the day is if you want to shiny hunt any of these Pokemon, don't do it in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. And all of this is so fascinating and really just makes me appreciate Spinda even more so, especially with how it was originally in Ruby and Sapphire. A relatively unremarkable Pokemon with an extremely unique gimmick that I'm surprised hasn't been tried out in other Pokemon, but I guess now we see the reason why. And so that was the story, which is currently still ongoing, of Spinda.
And if you're wondering, to this day, Spinda still has these same restrictions placed on it. But those have been some of the weird cases in which Pokemon were not allowed online for one reason or another. As we move forward, we see things like this less and less. Again, BDSP was just the odd one out. There are some Pokemon that cannot be brought from one generation into the next, but that's a different type of case I'll talk about later. For now, I just want to thank every channel member, especially the great Gators. Actual Clown, Black Ice, Cheeseburger Lasers, Dan V. Farrar, Dunkachino II, Eevee, Generic, Justin R, Cosmo Zero, Lil Swiss, Meme Supreme, Nathan Boyd, Snowman Nobi, Oleg Studios, Phantom, Peel the Genius, Quago, Taijurai, Viz, Volity, and Pastel Blood. If you would like to support, get a shout out here as well as access to emotes and comments and live streams and sometimes early videos, you can become a channel member today. You can also follow me on Twitter as well for more memes. Anyway, this has been GatorX, and I'll catch you all later.
You can conquer new opponents with Pokemon Trading Card Game Black and White Noble Victories. Over 50 newly discovered Pokemon, plus a TCG online code card in every theme deck. Each theme deck of 60 cards sold separately, one code card per theme deck.